How fast can you go pro in every Wii Sport? When it comes to ideas surrounding the mastery of a certain skill, none are more prevalent than Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule, which dictates that for someone to become world class in a specific field, they'd have to devote a mind-boggling 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to it. Now, much like many of my hottest takes, this rule has had its fair share of naysayers, with many writing it off as just a myth or even a coping mechanism for the less talented. Okay, maybe I made that second part up, but let's put that theory to the test, shall we? After all, there's no possible way it'd take me 10,000 hours to go pro in Wii Sports, right? Fuck. Ah, piss off. Ah, shit. Oh my fucking god. Now before we get into the runs themselves, there's an extremely important aspect that we need to talk about, the me's. And because this is a video where we're trying to complete things in a somewhat speedy manner, I wanted to make sure it was lore accurate. To achieve this, I chose to replicate athletes that have managed to reach the top of the world in their respective sport. For tennis, I had to go with the Spanish superstar Carlos Alcaraz, who managed to reach number 1 in the ATP rankings at the age of just 19, making him the youngest player to ever hold the top rank. Baseball was a harder decision. See, unlike the rest of the sports here, baseball is a team-based game, which makes crowning a single star amongst them even harder. Now I chose to look at players who had received an NL MVP award, and while Vida Blue received the award at 21, I thought it more fitting to choose Bryce Harper, who received it at 22 years of age, only because he was also the youngest player to ever be chosen for an All-Stars team. Now, as much as I wanted Jason Belmont to take the spot for bowling, it would be in poor taste to choose him over Rafael Peng Nepomuceno, the youngest player to ever win the Bowling World Cup, making him the world champion at just 19 years old. He would then go on to win it another 3 times, cementing himself as a legend in the sport, as well as a good few Guinness World Records for himself. Golf was always going to be Lydia Ko, the New Zealand prodigy who sat atop the women's world golf rankings at just 17 years old. For some context, the most decorated golfer in history, Tiger Woods, achieved rank 1 at 21 years old, and even that is considered absolutely phenomenal. You may also recognize Lydia from the most recent Olympics in Paris, where she is the reigning Olympic champion. Now boxing could be anyone. There's so many weight classes and belts that I ended up choosing Wilfredo Benitez, who became the youngest world champion in history when he won the light welterweight belt at 17 years old. This means this guy won a championship fight while still in high school, as his classmates watched and cheered him on. That is honestly unreal. Anyway, with these legends created, let's see just how fast they can become pro in their respective sports. First up is tennis, and before we even get to play our first match, there's an important decision Carlos needs to make. How many sets does he have in him? Out of every sport listed here, tennis is the only one where the opposing CPU exponentially increase in skill level the higher up you go.
This is not okay.
So in order to get the most skill rating out of these weaker CPUs, Carlos decided to start with 5-set matches. He may be young, but it seems he's also incredibly smart. As for the game itself, there isn't really too much to say. I mean, we've all played Wii Tennis before. There is one small thing we can do to help speed up these earlier games, and that's the iconic fastball.
That's the game!
This blinding serve decimates weaker CPUs, and ideally Carlos would want to abuse the living hell out of them to finish each match much faster. The only problem is... yeah, Carlos didn't exactly have the timing down to begin with. Not to worry though, as Carlos made short work of his first 3 opponents, amassing a skill rating of 420. And it's here where things started to get a bit dicey. His next doubles opponents were Jessie and Silk. Silky? Silke? Doesn't matter. If you hadn't noticed by now though, their skill levels seemed to be far higher than Carlos's at this point in time. And while the game started off well, Carlos started to get this sinking feeling of dread, as these two had managed to do something no one else had done up until now.
No! It can't be!
Yeah, so it was around this point that the CPU started to return fastballs on a more consistent basis. Not only that, but these two had a few extra tricks up their sleeves that Carlos wasn't ready for, and it led to them scoring a few more points than the earlier CPUs. Carlos finished the match strong though, and ascended past 500 skill rating at around the 10-minute mark. This is when things started to get ridiculous. See, despite Carlos being a mere 565 skill rating, the skill and class he displayed in his previous matches got him fast tracked to the pro leagues, as from this point on, he'll have to beat CPUs who have reached pro status. And if you thought that skill rating was just for show, you'd be wrong.
The back team wins!
This was the first set Carlos had lost, and while he did end up closing out this match with a win, that one set loss made him switch up to single matches. This was a strategic decision made to counteract any potential losses he'd face in the future. See, instead of losing 3 sets to 0, if he were to lose a single set match, he'd be able to get right back into another match, saving time in the long run. Now, despite saying that, Carlos is a prodigy among prodigies, and while some of these matches were close, Carlos was able to take home the win again and again and again. Carlos had now amassed a monumental skill rating of 919, meaning if he could win the next 3-set match, he'd be considered a pro. Now, given the fact that these two were an astronomical 1000 skill rating ahead of Carlos at this point, it was always going to be a tough match. These two had no problems returning fastballs and even utilized their front player far better than previous opponents. Even so, Carlos was able to take the first set, although it was very close. It was here when the opposition started to lock in though. At this level, the CPUs always serve fast balls, and while Carlos's reaction time is world class, they still sometimes led to quick conversions by the opposition. And just like that, the match was tied 1-1. It's moments like these that separate the ordinary from the extraordinary. The ones who are able to dig deep and push through in the face of adversity are the only ones that make it to the top. And Carlos? Ah, shit. Well, he lost. But at least he gained enough from this close game to push him past that 1000 skill rating, therefore cementing himself as a professional Wii Sports tennis player in just over 30 minutes. We move on to baseball, which is arguably the toughest sport to go pro in out of the whole bunch. I never managed it as a kid, but thankfully it's not up to me this time. It's up to Bryce Harper. Baseball is split into 2 parts, batting and pitching. One of these is exceptionally easy, and the other one is seemingly impossible. I'll let you decide which one's which.
You're out! 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 You're out!
Now, ideally, you'd want to amass a huge lead in runs and then win by mercy rule after a single innings. This was Bryce's original plan, and had it gone the way he hoped, he'd be a pro in no time. But alas, it didn't go as Bryce had hoped. Oh, I'm still dog shit at the sport. After 15 minutes of intense baseball, Bryce had amassed a measly 284 skill points. Fortunately, he had won his first 3 games, and while they weren't by a significant margin, a win's a win. As I mentioned at the start of the video, baseball is a team sport, meaning Bryce would need to trust in his teammates and hope they'd pull through for him.
You're out!
In all seriousness though, Wii Baseball is the hardest sport by far, and a lot of it has to do with the gimmicky controls and the blatant cheesiness of the sport itself. See, when a ball is struck up into the sky, it's entirely up to luck whether or not the fielder will catch it. Now, I do say it's luck based, but what tends to happen is the opposing CPUs will almost always catch your aerial hits. But when it's them on the striking side, Bryce's team will always find a way to drop it. This may not be a big deal during these early games, but as we rise in skill rating, aspects like this make every match that much more uncertain. Even so, Bryce remained headstrong and he managed to lead his team to another 2 victories, with one of them smashing the ball straight out of the park. Whereas it took 20 minutes to reach 280 skill points, by the 30-minute mark, Bryce had managed to climb his way past the halfway point to a skill rating of 532. A lot of this can be attributed to his 5th match, where he put on an absolute masterclass, smashing his very own home run and setting up an 11-0 lead before cleaning out their batters with some dirty splitters. Speaking of splitters, these were the main pitches Bryce abused to win all of his games. While there is some risk in using them, the CPUs hardly ever leave them, resulting in easy strikeouts across the board. By this point, Bryce had finally found his footing, but then Bryce stumbled across his most intimidating opponent yet. Bro, is that fucking AI? Now, while the typical human might fall victim to the thought of facing an AI in an unfair game like Wii Baseball, Bryce doesn't have those same insecurities, as he once again smashed a home run for himself. His team followed in his footsteps as they clobbered the balls out of the park, setting up a nice 6-0 lead. Bryce once again pulled out the cheesy splitters, earning him his 6th win in a row. Now, it may not be the fastest rise to pro status, but this playstyle was extremely consistent, as Bryce racked up win after win after win. But then something unprecedented happened. In his 7th match against Steph, the opposing CPUs hit a home run of their own, bringing the score well within losable range. Up until now, Bryce had won all of his games via the mercy rule, and barely had it gone to a 2nd inning. innings. With the score as it was here though, there was no doubt that it'd go to another innings where the possibility of losing wasn't entirely out of the question. Thankfully Lydia pulled through, smashing the ball out of the park and securing another 3 runs for the team. Bryce then finished off the remaining batters with a couple of splitters, putting an end to the closest match so far. By this point, the CPUs had caught on, and in the following games they too would pitch splitter after splitter after splitter. Sometimes they'd do all 3 in a row, and while I had gotten pretty good at leaving them, there was always that worry that the team would strike themselves out. Splitters themselves are easy to tell apart from other pitches as there's no spin on the ball. The unfortunate part about this though, is that the CPUs will often mix in fastballs with their splitters. If you're expecting a splitter and in turn get a fastball, it leaves you with very little time to react to it. This strategy led to multiple strikeouts, making it far harder to get decent runs in the first innings. Bryce's 9th and final match saw him going up against Saburo, an underarm pitcher that threw some incredibly fast balls. And I don't mean the type of pitch, I mean the throws were literally fast as fuck. Holy shit. Even so, Bryce and his team had become so good at this point that they managed to set up a nice 6-0 lead before changing sides. You're probably wondering how well pro CPUs handle splitters.
Strike. Batter out.
Yeah, not very well. Using directional splitters that curve towards the batter gives them a false sense of security, and they'll most likely swing at the ball, resulting in more easy strikeouts. And with that, Bryce had won his 9th game in a row, not only giving him a 100% win rate, but also pushing him well into the pro range with a skill rating of 1029. Because of the fact that some of these games went to the 3rd innings, the time taken to become a pro was far longer than in tennis, sitting at just over an hour. Now I had always assumed that baseball would take the longest, and funnily enough we're going from that to what I and I'm sure all of you predicted to be the fastest sport. What's there to say about bowling? I'd argue it's the most popular sport out of the whole bunch, and the easiest to get the hang of. I remember countless instances of my younger self dropping perfect scores of 300, so there's no doubt in my mind that the world champion Peng can do the exact same. I'm sure that was just a warm-up game. Okay, so maybe Wii bowling is a lot harder than I remember. For whatever reason, I just couldn't find the perfect angle or throw. It didn't help that I was playing in my room, which doesn't give me too much freedom when it comes to swinging my arms around like an idiot. This resulted in a lot of awkward throws, and half the time I couldn't even let go of the damn thing properly. But alas, bowling has by far the quickest turnaround between each game. While these earlier scores weren't anything to be proud of, I mean, come on, Peng, you're the world champion for God's sake. The quick turnarounds meant that he could get straight back into another game without wasting too much time wailing in his depression. Honestly, Peng gave it his all, and every game he was trying new things. Whether that be straights or slightly curved shots from both the left and right of the center line, unfortunately none of these really led to consistent strikes. He was, however, able to pick up spares on a consistent basis, which helped him claw back some relatively decent scores throughout the first half of the challenge. Peng reached the halfway point in under 10 minutes and was significantly faster than both Carlos and Bryce. He then went on to complete his best game yet, despite only getting 2 strikes. Now say what you will about his inability to get strikes. When it comes to clutching up spares, there's no one better in the world than my man Peng here. Despite setting a new record for himself, Peng still wasn't satisfied and vowed to get even better. And boy, did he get better. Back-to-back records, and the first time he posted a score of 200 plus. It was at this point that Peng decided he was going to go for that perfect 300, and with his current form, there was no doubt in my mind that he was going to achieve it. Well, maybe on the next game. My god, these scores don't warrant the epic Mario Galaxy soundtrack. After a strong finish on his 9th game, Peng was sitting at a skill rating of 977. Not only did this signify how close he was to going pro, but it also meant that he had 1 game left to get that perfect 300. From here, every throw counted.
Mission failed. We'll get 'em next time.
So Peng failed us. This first ball had such a great impact on him that he went on to perform the worst he had during this whole challenge. He was getting splits left, right, and center. He was missing easy spare pickups and he couldn't seem to land a strike to save his life. This game was so lackluster that he even lost some skill rating, pushing him further away from that pro status. For most people, this experience would be soul crushing, but Peng isn't just anybody. He wasn't about to let this small bump stop him from achieving his ultimate dream, and thankfully there was a silver lining here. See, because he lost that skill rating, it meant that he once again had one last chance to achieve that perfect 300. And let me tell you, he wasn't about to let that second chance die in vain. Well, At least Pang brought this game back with a few strikes, and while the overall score didn't parrot that elusive perfect score, it was good enough to push Pang into the pro scene with a skill rating of 1009. Despite the small setbacks faced, Pang managed to complete all of this in under 20 minutes, making him the fastest so far to become a pro in Wii Sports. We're now onto the dark horse of the entire video, golf. And who better than Lydia Ko to ascend the ranks in order to become a pro? Now just like tennis, there are a few modes we can choose between. Unlike tennis though, these choices are separated based on the difficulty of each course. There's also the choice of completing the full 9-hole course. Now I assumed the hardest courses would award more skill rating, the catch being it would be harder to complete a solid game under par, which would counteract the extra points you would receive from them. Because I had no idea which course was the best to complete, Lydia decided to play through each course at least once. Beginner was up first, and call it nerves, call it skill issue, but Lydia was certainly playing like a beginner. The beginner course has hardly any wind to worry about, and the holes present aren't exactly tough, mainly featuring long straights that you can easily drive down. Even so, Lydia completed her first game by sinking a par, then another par, before finishing off with a bogey to end with a +1 score. Pretty subpar for the reigning Olympic champion. Thankfully things picked up in the intermediate course, which was weird because unlike the beginner course, these holes feature stronger winds and far more obstacles to avoid. Even so, she nailed her first shot before putting on a masterclass with her putting to secure a birdie. She then sunk a par on the second hole before demonstrating her world-class chipping on the third hole. It may have been a bogey in the end, but this was already a better performance than her attempt on the beginner course. All that was left was the expert course, and this one didn't start so well. The awkward layout of this hole paired with the copious amounts of rough terrain led to an unfortunate double bogey. Thankfully she was able to secure a par on the second hole, and if things weren't bad enough, the game essentially fucked her off in the third hole. Remember when I mentioned her world-class chipping ability? Well, that talent was still present here, but no amount of skill can save you from this kind of bullshit. That's the type of shot you'd see once a decade, and Lydia had nothing to show for it in the end. Regardless, from these initial run-throughs, it seemed to me that farming the intermediate course was the way to go. Each hole could be completed in a few shots at most, and they weren't too much harder than the beginner ones, while also giving far more skill rating in return. The following games went how you'd expect them to. The driver shots weren't exactly spectacular, but the chips more than made up for that.
Wow.
Despite these shots being incredibly close, by this point she still hadn't managed to get a chip in. Going into the 5th match, however, she was looking to change that.
Chip in.
This spectacular shot gave her the confidence to attempt a full 9-hole game. At just under 15 minutes, she was at 422 skill rating, which honestly isn't very much. But considering her current form, there was hope going into this 9-hole course. She started strong on the beginner holes and maintained this form into the intermediate ones. The expert holes were another story though.
You suck!
Yeah. Looks like we're going back to the intermediate course, where she consistently sunk birdies, hole after hole after hole. It didn't take long for her to be at the point where one good game would take her over the edge. On the contrary though, if she didn't perform well on this last game, there was a very good chance she'd have to play another. So what did Lydia do in the face of this immense pressure? She'd go on to play the best game she had ever played. With a performance like that, there's no doubt she deserves pro status, and at just over 30 minutes, this puts her amongst the fastest players to reach the goal. We're now onto the last sport, boxing, and this one is the one I feared the most alongside baseball.
I'm fucking shitting myself.
I've always felt that the controls of this sport were pretty gimmicky to say the least, and with the limited space in my room, I knew Wilfred was going to struggle during his ascent to stardom. Either way, the first few fights went as you'd expect. Wilfred played off his jab while slipping in straight rights to hurt his opponents. Eventually they all crumbled to Wilfred's power, with many of these fights being over before the first round ended. At his current rate, Wilfred was set to beat Pang in terms of speed as he racked up win after win after win. By the 8-minute mark, he had already passed the halfway point with a skill rating of 590. Unfortunately for Wilfred though, he was about to enter what I like to call the Hall of Pound for Pound Champions, which is essentially the group of CPUs within the 700 to 900 skill range. I'm honestly not sure what it is about these guys, but I've always struggled to fight them. It's around this point that you need to seriously consider weaving to the sides to dodge their hits. If you time these dodges well, you'll enter a state of slow-mo, allowing you to get some easy counter hits on your opponent. The only problem is that the opposing CPUs also used these strategies and Wilfred found himself missing a lot more hits than usual. The fight against Emma was the first real challenge, and while she never managed to knock down Wilfred, she did get extremely close to the point where Wilfred had to barrage her down from half HP, all while he was on a slither of HP himself. The fights only got harder from here, with Wilfred suffering his first loss to Nick in his 10th fight. Honestly, this one was kind of bullshit. Nick had been knocked down 4 times by this point, and had gotten up every single time, whereas this was only the second time Wilfred had been knocked down. Yet it still led to a KO. Like what? Thankfully though, the game paired Wilfred up against Nick once again in his next fight, and after a swift few knockdowns, Wilfred had gotten his sweet revenge. The fights from here only got closer and closer, and some of them even went to the 3rd round before someone got KO'd. The fight against Tatsuaki shows just how dominant you have to be in these fights if you're wishing to climb the ranks. Wilfred knocked this guy down 5 times across 3 rounds, with the final knockdown resulting in a KO. Just for some reference, Tatsuaki was a good 100 skill rating above Wilfred before this fight, so you'd expect a decent increase in skill rating following his KO victory, right? You can't be fucking serious. So, let me get this straight. Not only do you have to win, but you also have to win convincingly enough without being knocked down yourself to gain skill rating at this level. This was going to be much harder than I thought. Not long after that depressing win against Tatsuaki, Wilfred had managed to claw his way within a frog's leap of pro status. The only one left standing in his way was Anna, the pro. Wilfred absolutely dismantled her from start to finish. Wilfred managed to slip most of Anna's punches while countering with plenty of his own. After the initial knockdown, things got somewhat dicey, but that's when Wilfred entered Ultra Instinct, knocking Anna down another 2 times, all while on 1 HP himself. This was an absolute masterclass by Wilfred, and it was probably his best fight throughout the entire challenge. What started off as a quick rush towards the pro scene slowly tapered off to a final completion time of just over 25 minutes. Even so, Wilfred remains one of the fastest athletes to go pro in Wii Sports. And there you have it. Those are the stories of 5 athletes who rose to pro status in the quickest times possible. Now obviously these aren't the most optimal times ever, as there are quite a few glitches that can be performed to complete certain sports faster. If you do want to see peak performance when it comes to Wii Sports, then I've included links to some of the fastest all-pro speedruns completed by people like Nomad and Booty Chief Man. For now though, this is the best I could do without much preparation at all. I do hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, do consider dropping a like and even subscribing. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all in the next video.